Hello. We're going to continue the life of Joseph today. We're going to be doing with Genesis 42 through 44. So I hope you'll get your Bibles and let's continue this wonderful story about this very godly man. And it's such a contrast because back in chapter 38, Judah acted so differently under similar circumstances, and here Joseph is presented really as such a righteous person. And yet he's going to do some things that show that everybody in the Old Testament has warts, and Joseph does too. He's really going to act tacky toward his brothers. And yet there's two different ways of looking at this, as there had been at most of the Old Testament account. Again, I've mentioned that I think that Rebekah and Jacob, though in a wrong way, did what they thought was the best of motives. I think that's true in chapter 38 of Tamar. And I really think that Joseph, though he comes across a little harsh in these two chapters, basically has a theological purpose, and that is to see if his brothers have really got over the exclusivism and favoritism that came to the surface so readily when they rejected him. He's going to kind of show favoritism toward Benjamin and see how they react. So maybe he's setting the stage and not really acting with a bad attitude. Beginning in Genesis 42:1, it says, "Now Jacob saw there was grain in Egypt." Rashi, a Jewish commentator from the Middle Ages, say that he had a vision. But I really think what was happening, everybody from Canaan was going down to Egypt to buy bread. And either Jacob saw someone going by with bread from Egypt, grain from Egypt, or he heard about it. And that fits the context much better. "And Jacob said to his sons, 'Why are you staring at each other?'" The implication is, don't just stand there, do something. Go down there and get us some bread. And he said, "Behold, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us from that place so that we may live and not die." The famine had become crucial. They had eaten all that Joseph sent the first time. No telling how much of their cattle had already died. And so it's really gotten bad. "And the 10 brothers of Joseph went down to buy grain from Egypt." Now the 10 brothers, why send all 10 of them? Well, some say for security. Some say because they only sold one man so much grain, and this way they could get 10 times the amount that one individual could buy. I'm not sure the reason. There's an obvious theological reason that God's going to fulfill the dream that Joseph had back in Genesis 37. "But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, 'I am afraid that harm may befall him.'" Now, Benjamin and Joseph, of course, were the only children of Jacob's favorite wife. And Joseph had been lost, and so the old man really doted on this young son. Now, Benjamin must have been somewhere over 20 by this time, but he was a very favorite. And Joseph's going to pick up on that and see if his brothers are still jealous. Now, notice if you would. So the sons of Israel, notice the change from Jacob to Israel. That happens all the time in Genesis. It's not two authors. It's just a variety here. Came to buy grain among those who were coming. You might want to go back to Genesis 32 through 33, where his name is changed from Jacob to Israel after he wrestled with the angel at the brook Jabbok. And then it says, "For the famine was in the land of Canaan." We learned from many of our historical records of this period that there were cyclical times of famine. They came about every 12 to 15 years, and they were very severe. This was not uncommon. It was very common in this part of the ancient world. "Now Joseph was the ruler over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land." Apparently he was second in command. Some of the technical names for this mentioned in other parts of Genesis would be like our vicer. And so he was the second in command of Pharaoh, and apparently he was in charge of selling grain not only to the Egyptians, but particularly to all the foreign people who came, and that's how he was involved in this. Now notice where it mentions, "And they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground." Now, this was very common. It wasn't unusual, but it did fulfill the dream back in chapter 37, verses 6 through 9. Now, there's only 10 of them here. Later on, they're going to bow down again. Benjamin will be with them. There's all 11 of the brothers in chapter 44:14. And so all the dream is fulfilled except for Jacob bowing down. Now, notice if you would where it mentions, "And Joseph saw his brothers, and he recognized them." Now, they were older when they had sold him some 20 years previously. They still had their beards. They still had their characteristic nomadic dress, and he recognized them very quickly. But now Joseph looked very different. As you know, the Egyptians were clean-shaven, and the Hebrews were bearded. They couldn't even cut or trim their beard. So here Joseph is, clean-shaven. He's 20 years older now. He's dressed in very fine clothes. He's in a position that they certainly were not expecting. He's also going to speak in Egyptian and use an interpreter when speaking with them. And he's going to even swear by the life of Pharaoh. And so the customs he uses are very Egyptian, and his brothers are not going to recognize him at all. Now what's happening here when it says, but he disguised himself to them and spoke to them harshly? What's this harshly about? Well, I really think it's not Joseph getting vengeance on his brothers. I really think what we have here is Joseph setting the stage to see if his brothers have really changed, if they've got over their jealousy toward him to some extent, and he's going to see that by the way they treat Benjamin in this certain set of circumstances that he's going to set. Now, notice if you would, where it mentions, he asked where they came from, and they said from the land of Canaan to buy food. But Joseph had recognized his brothers, although they did not recognize him. And Joseph remembered the dream. That's Genesis 37, 6 through 9. That's what got him in trouble in the first place. Now, you got to admit, he was a little arrogant at that point, and God had certainly cured that through all of his encounters with Potiphar and the prison, and my goodness, he certainly had been purged of any kind of arrogance that he had. Notice it says, you are spies. Now, why would he say that? Literally, it means you've come to spy out the nakedness of the land or see how to trick us. Well, I was interested. The rabbi said that Jacob told his sons to enter from 10 different gates into the capital because that way nobody would suspect them of coming together. And so the rabbis say that Joseph knew they entered by 10 different gates, and that's why he said they were spies. I think it's a bit much, but that's rabbinical theology at that point. Now, you have come to look at the undefended parts of the land, the nakedness of the land, is what the literal phrase there is. And when they said to him, no, my Lord, that's the word Adonai used as sir, like kurios in the New Testament is sometimes used for sir or mister, title of respect. But your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man, and we are honest men. That's some kind of irony, I think, for they certainly weren't honest when they sold Joseph, but they had come to be upstanding men and from one father. Your servants are not spies. Yet he said to them, no, but you have come to look at the undefended parts of the land. But they said, your servants are 12 brothers in all, and the son of one man in the land of Canaan, and behold, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no more. Now, of course, that referred to Joseph. And Joseph said to them, it is as I have said, you are spies. By this you will be tested, by the life of Pharaoh. Now, many people, and John Calvin on back, have said that Joseph here sinned in swearing by the life of Pharaoh. Now, what did he mean? Well, there are several possibilities. Number one, he may have been trying to keep his kind of Egyptian disguise by swearing by Pharaoh's life. This is very much in line with their religious worship that Pharaoh was son of the sun god Ra. It's a way of swearing by the deities of Egypt. Some say Joseph was just doing it because he was trying to keep his disguise well. Others say no, he was just caught up in the customs of the Egyptians. Others say he sinned in doing this. And pay your nickel and take your choice. Now notice what it mentions here in verse 16. Send one of you so that you may get your brother while the rest of you remain confined, that your words may be tested whether there is truth in you. But if not, by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies. And so he really sets the stage for them to have to decide if they're going to stay in prison and send one back for Benjamin. So he put them all in prison for 3 days. Maybe he wanted them to share his experience of how it felt in prison all those years. And I really think he must have been in prison from somewhere between 2 to 10 years. Wow, boy, don't you know he wondered, God, have you forgotten me? Do you care about me? But now Joseph said to them on the 3rd day, do this and live, for I fear. And the word here is Elohim, not Yahweh. That giveaway is disguise. Elohim, same way he used of Potiphar's wife, that general title for God in the ancient Near East. He tells them he fears God, and he's afraid all their families will starve if he keeps them all in prison. So he's going to let all of them go home with grain except one. And that one he's going to put in prison until they bring back their youngest son. And then they said to one another, truly we are guilty concerning our brother, because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us, yet we would not listen. Therefore, this distress has come upon us. Joseph understood what they were saying, but he played like he didn't. They were speaking Hebrew to each other. This is very significant. They realized that something is happening in their life in a negative sense because of a sin they had committed earlier against their brother. This same general trend of a sense of guilt and foreboding can be seen not only in verse 21 and in 22, but in verse 28 and also particularly in chapter 44, verse 16. It's the ideal they believe that God is an ethical God, that He is involved in His world, that they have committed a terrible sin against their own brother, and they're reaping the whirlwind of that kind of lifestyle. And that's what they're saying to each other. You know, must have ripped Joseph's heart out to listen to them talk about that. And Reuben answered and said, "Did I not tell you?" Now, Reuben kind of defends himself. This is probably the first time that Joseph realized that the oldest son of his father had really tried to save him earlier. I'm sure he didn't know that. Matter of fact, this is the first time we really know that Joseph cried out for help to his brothers. And earlier it just said they went and sat down and ate dinner after throwing him in the pit. Pretty callous boys at that point. Now, you might want to go back to Genesis 37, 22 through 24 is where Reuben tries to help. "Do not sin against the boy, but you would not listen. Now comes the reckoning for his blood." There was a view in the Old Testament, probably goes back to Cain and Abel, where the death of one person innocently cried out from the ground in revenge to those who had taken that life. Reuben alludes to that same thought right here. Notice then it says in verse 23, "And they did not know, however, that Joseph understood, for there was an interpreter between them." Joseph used an interpreter, but he, of course, still understood Hebrew. "And they turned away from them and wept. But when he returned to them, he spoke to them. He took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes." Now, why Simeon? Well, some have said when he found out Reuben had tried to help him, he didn't feel like he could tie up Reuben. Besides, Reuben was the oldest son and the leader of this group. Some say no, it's because Simeon was so stinking mean. Now, Simeon and Levi are the ones who killed all the circumcised men of Shechem earlier because one of them had raped their daughter, their sister Diana. And so maybe they're saying Simeon's just getting what he deserved. But for whatever reason, he was the second oldest, and he is the one that's going to be taken. Notice they're going to bind him right in front of them. Maybe an extra incentive to hurry home and get your brother and come back and get Simeon out of jail. Then Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain and to restore every man's money to his sack. And it gave to them provisions for the journey. And this provisions was extra from what was in the sacks. Now, that's going to be important to the development of this plot, okay? They had provisions for their cattle and provisions for themselves, separate from where the money was hidden in the large grain sacks. So they loaded their donkeys with grain and departed from there. And as one of them opened his sacks to give his donkey fodder at a lodging place. Now some say that was the first night, but probably it was much more closer to home. And when they tell their daddy Jacob, they're going to not mention that fact that one of them knew earlier. I think it's more kind of a collapsing of the story for the sake of a shortness when they get to their daddy and not trying to say, we knew it earlier and didn't tell. I don't think that's at all in the text like that. Now notice Notice down in verse 28, saying, "What is this that God has done for us?" They still feel guilty. They still feel like God has done this to them. What? Put the money back in their sacks? Well, they feel like they're going to get in trouble with the Egyptians for having this money, and this same sense of guilt pervades this whole account. Then they came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan and told him all that happened before them, saying, and here they go over the entire story again. And basically, look at the end of verse 34. It says, "And you may trade in the land." Now, the implication is if they bring their brother back and show they're not spies, then they can establish a regular purchase of food on a regular basis. But if they don't bring their brother Benjamin back, they can't buy any more food. That seems to be the implication. They're going to need to return for more food, we see in chapter 43 too. Now, the father is very, very reluctant to do this. Look at verse 36. "You have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more, Simeon is no more, and you would take Benjamin? All these things are against me." There's almost an implication here that Jacob knew that those boys had done something that caused Joseph to be lost. And now they've lost Simeon. And they want to take Benjamin away too. And Jacob is just really upset. We learn from several parts of Genesis that he is still grieving over Joseph. It's almost like the joy of life left him when he lost Joseph. And now he's not about to lose the apple of his eye, Benjamin, the only other son of his favorite wife. Now the first one to speak up here is Reuben. And Reuben, now this is kind of dumb. Reuben says, "Oh, Daddy, If I lose Benjamin, you can kill two of my children. Now, Jacob's going, oh, that's great. I lose my favorite son, and I'm going to kill two of my grandsons? That didn't make sense worth a flip. Well, people say, well, Reuben was just emotional. Well, it may have been emotional, but that wasn't smart. and Jacob's going to say, no way am I letting you take Benjamin with you. So in chapter 43, they've eaten all the food. There's nothing left. They're about to get really hungry again. This time Judah is going to come and talk. Now you see that beginning in verse 8. And Judah said to his father Israel, send the lad with me, and I will arise and go, that we may live and not die, we as well as you and the little ones. Now this is pragmatism, friend. Judah's saying, look, Dad, if we don't go buy food, everybody's going to die, including you and Benjamin anyway. Let me have Benjamin. We'll get some food. I promise you I'll take care of him, and I'll bring him home. Otherwise, everybody's going to die. Well, the father understands that kind of logic. So he says, I myself will be a surety for him. You may hold me responsible for him. If I do not bring him back to you to set him before you, then let me bear the blame before you forever. Now there's a veiled reference here. It is pretty oblique, I must admit, about a view in the afterlife. Now Judah says, if I don't bring him back, Dad, forever and ever I'll bear this guilt before you. There is a real sense in the Old Testament. You see it clearly with the death of the kings, where it says David was buried with his fathers, slept with his fathers. Implication that even in the afterlife there is some kind of connection between families, and Judah is making an allusion to that by saying, I'll just bear this sin forever, And the implication there is an afterlife. Now, notice in verse 10, for if we had not delayed, surely by now we could have returned twice. It's been a long time now. Simeon's been in jail a long time waiting for his brothers. He's going, where are those guys? Now in verse 11, and their father Israel said to them, if it must be so, then take some of the best produce of the land. Now he's going to talk about some food that was in Canaan. But it wasn't the kind of food you could live on. You certainly couldn't feed cattle almonds and pistachio nuts and wild honey. They needed grain to live. That was the staff of life for them. But these are some unique products of Canaan that Jacob knew that Egypt liked. So he said, take those and take the double money. Now this offering a gift to a powerful person was a very common way in that day. Maybe that's why bribes are still so common in the Near East. Even today, they got used to it. It's a cultural thing, and they still do it very much. Notice in verse 14 where he says, take him with you, and may God Almighty grant you compassion in the sight of the man. Now this God Almighty is El Shaddai. El, from the root to be strong, the general name for God in the ancient East. And the term Shaddai is from a woman's breast. It's the idea of God as a mother who, how mothers are. They love their kids. They would die for them. They nurse them, provide everything for them. So this is God as a loving parent. It's a patriarchal name for God. It's my opinion from the book of Exodus. They did not call God Yahweh until after Moses, at least in understanding fully what the term meant. Most of the patriarchs called him El Shaddai. And I think if you take it from strong and woman's breast, it really means the all-sufficient one. May God provide all that you need is the implication of this. Now, they come on down, and when Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to his household steward, bring the men into the house, slay an animal. That was pretty unusual. Egyptians didn't eat a lot of flesh. Matter of fact, one reason they say that the Egyptians wouldn't eat with anybody else is because they had cows as sacred, and these other people ate cows, kind of like modern Hindus. Get nervous around hamburgers. Well, that was something about the Egyptians, I think. So he plans this big meal, and they're all going to have a good time. Now, it's very interesting to hear. Notice in verse 18, they're afraid someone's going to steal their donkeys. Man, these are country bumpkins come to town. Here's these nomadic men, and they're in the palace of the second in command of Egypt. And notice what's happening. They're afraid that this powerful rich man is just trying to steal their donkeys. Now, isn't that guilt coming back, and fear and imagination coming back again? Notice in verse 19 it says Joseph's house steward. Now this is really some fella. Notice what he says all the way through here, down through 25. He's mentioned again in 23. He's mentioned again in 24. This man may have even been taught about Yahweh from Joseph, because this man talks about that God's involved in this, and God's going to protect you, and God's going to bring it about. This man seems to know God, and the only place he could have was from Joseph. Maybe Joseph did some evangelism while he was in the land of Egypt. Why he never wrote back to his parents, we're never told. He never contacted them until they contacted him. Maybe he was waiting for God to fulfill the dream. So here we have the party, basically. It starts in 26 and following, and they're going to come and bow down again, all 11 of them, which will fulfill this reference back to Genesis 37, the dream that Jacob had. Now, notice verse 30 where it says, when he saw Benjamin, he said, "Oh, may God be gracious to you." And my New American Standard has, he was deeply stirred. Now, the root idea here, basically, is his viscera churned. Now, what that basically means is, in the ancient world, there were different parts of the body were different seats of the emotion. The lower viscera, the kidneys, the bowels, were the seat of the emotion. And friend, if you ever ate hot sauce too late, you know why they thought that was the seat of the emotion. To them, the heart was the seat of the whole personality, the thoughts, the volition. The midriff was a sign of intelligence. That'll make some of you feel better, wouldn't it? Well, anyway, that's some of the ancient deals. Here's his viscera churned within him. But he got away, he wept by himself, he came back out, washed his face, and he served them a meal. Now, literally it says, set on bread. Set on bread. That's very interesting. It's an obvious Egyptian idiom for dinner. Now, it's going to say they sat down here in verse 33. That's interesting because the Hebrews reclined on their left elbow. But from all of the pictures coming out of Egypt in archaeological sense, we see Egyptians sit on little stools or in chairs. So it shows, again, the historicity of this account. Again, Joseph was seated by himself. That's exactly the way that these Egyptian dinners were done. Now, Joseph was served by himself. Now, what Joseph is going to do is serve Benjamin extra portions, make a big deal over him. He wants to see if his brothers are still jealous. And boy, he's really going to set the stage, I want to tell you, by him flattering Benjamin, by God be gracious to you, giving him 5 times food. Now, whether that's literal or an idiom, I don't know. I'm sure all of them had all they could eat. I don't think Benjamin had 5 times the normal. Boy, I'd be sick. Now, notice it says here in verse 32, the Egyptians could not eat bread with the Hebrews. Now that may go back to chapter 39, verse 6, about how Joseph was in charge of everything in Potiphar's house except the food. We know from Herodotus, chapter 2, verse 41, that they wouldn't even use the same knife or cooking utensils. It was a religious thing, apparently, more than a racial bias. I think it had religious connotations. For this was loathsome to the Egyptians to eat. We found out that later they really hated shepherds. One reason God let them go into Egypt as shepherds was because the Egyptians wouldn't have anything to do with them. They kept their cultural identity together, which they were really losing in Canaan, as chapter 38 and Judah and Tamar shows. Now, notice in verse 34, he took portions from them from his own table, exactly like we know Egyptian customs, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times. Now, in chapter 44, then he commanded the household servants, saying, fill the men's sacks with food, and they got all the food. And then he makes kind of it's a plot, it's what it is. He said, now hide my golden cup in this youngest boy's sack. I'm sure the servants thought, what is going on here? But they did it, and they left, and then they went out to catch him. And the boys are saying, anybody who stole this, let him be killed. Kind of like what Jacob said about his wife stealing the gods. He didn't know that his favorite wife had stole Laban's gods, but she did. They're honest. They said, may the person die who did this. Now, what has happened, they opened all the sacks, and everything was fine. The money was there, but not this golden thing. Got to the last boy. I'm sure they did it in order. And guess what happened? There it was. And it was a special cup. It was a special cup that Joseph drank out of. Now it says he used it for divination in verse 5. Well, I don't know what Joseph's doing divination for anyway. This is the term used in Deuteronomy 18:10 for a soothsaying. It basically has the etymology of to whisper like a ventriloquist or a trickster, or a whisper like talking to the dead. It also comes from the root to hiss, and some say it's connected with Satan and therefore the evil powers. But the Septuagint translates this augury, or knowing the will of God by looking at the flight of birds. Some say it's just Joseph keeping up his Egyptian disguise, and I like that better, to tell you the truth. And so, boy, here they catch Benjamin. They all begin to tear their clothes, a sign of mourning. They go back to Joseph's house. And Judah comes up and says, can I speak to you just for a minute, sir? And so apparently Judah went up to him, and really we find something of the intercessory prayer of Moses that's so wonderful later on in Exodus is found here in Judah's mouth. And some say you really see Judah as a spiritual leader here. Well, I think that's true, but he also made his father a promise that went into the afterlife, and he didn't want to break that, that's for sure. So here he is saying, sir, and he tells him this whole story again about how God's punishing us for something we did to our brother years ago, and please let me take this boy's place, for if I don't bring him home, our father will die, and I'll be your slave forever. And at this point, Joseph couldn't stand it anymore. He just breaks down and begins to cry. I want to pick up on something first, though. Look in verse 30. It says, since his life is bound up in the lad's life. Jacob had really turned his life so inward after the loss of Joseph that Benjamin had become everything to him. He didn't even recognize how much his other boys loved him, I wonder. You think Jacob really thought that the lie of the Messiah was going to come through Benjamin? He must have thought it was going to come through Joseph. And here's a perfect example of who you would think God would pick. Here's this godly person. Is not the lie of the Messiah. Why? Because God has done everything to say it's not going to be the firstborn, it's not going to be the most moral person, because God wants to make sure it's His choice, not man's. It's His resources, not man's resources. So the line is not going to come through Benjamin or Joseph, but through Judah. But I don't think Jacob really knew that at this point anyway. Well, then we had the story finishing. It will come about it. He sees the lad is not with us, he will die, and your servant will bring his gray hair, which is an idiom, of course, for old age, down to Sheol. Now, Sheol is basically, and it's obvious here, to the grave. It's a way of speaking of the afterlife. The Hebrews believed they had a kind of a shadowy, conscious existence after death. Everybody went to the same place. There was no real fun. There was no real fellowship. There was no real joy. But there was a sense of corporate consciousness among families. And so it's a way of saying the place of the afterlife. And so anyway, Joseph continues to be melted by what's going to happen. And basically in chapter 45, he reveals to his brothers what he's done. Well, I think it's another interesting account in Hebrews. I do think that Joseph was trying to test his brothers, not just get revenge. And I do think God blessed him for that attitude. And what a reunion it must have been. Don't you know his brothers croaked when they found out who that man was? Well, I've enjoyed being with you, and I'll see you again, same time, same place next week. God bless you.